A guard shuts down Camilla's son. Not even Charles can override this order. Emotional story. The morning began like any other at the heavily protected estate. The sky was pale, the air calm, and the guards were already in position long before the first important visitor was expected. Every movement was planned, every gate checked twice. For the guards, routine was everything. Routine kept people safe. Routine prevented mistakes. Among them stood a senior guard, experienced and quiet, someone who had served for many years without drawing attention to himself. He was not famous, not powerful, but he carried something stronger than both: responsibility. That morning before his shift fully began, he was called aside and handed a sealed instruction. It was brief, clear, and serious. There was no room for discussion, no space for interpretation. The message was simple: access to the inner grounds was restricted. No exceptions. The guard read it twice. He understood immediately that this was not an ordinary order. Orders like this were rare, and when they arrived, they changed everything. He folded the paper carefully and placed it inside his jacket. His face remained calm, but inside he felt the weight of what was coming. He knew people would question him. He knew someone would be upset, but duty did not allow hesitation. Not long after, a familiar vehicle approached the main gate. The staff nearby noticed it at once. Camilla's son was arriving. Normally, his visits were smooth and quiet. He was known, recognized, and usually welcomed without delay. The guards had seen him before. There was never a problem. The vehicle stopped and he stepped out with confidence. His posture showed comfort, not caution. He greeted a few staff members with a nod, expecting the gates to open as they always did. To him, this place was not unfamiliar. It felt almost like an extension of privilege. But that morning, the gates did not move. The senior guard stepped forward, raising his hand politely but firmly. His voice was calm when he spoke, respectful but unyielding. He informed the visitor that entry could not be granted at this time. The words were simple, but their meaning was heavy. Camilla's son paused, surprised. At first he assumed there had been a misunderstanding. These things happened. A new guard, a wrong name, a delayed message. He smiled slightly and explained who he was, expecting the issue to disappear immediately. The guard listened without interrupting. When the explanation ended, he nodded once and repeated the same response. Entry was not allowed. The mood shifted. Staff members standing nearby sensed it. Conversation stopped. Eyes turned toward the gate. Silence grew uncomfortable. The son's expression changed from relaxed to confused. He asked for clarification, still calm, still polite. The guard explained that a direct order had been issued and that it applied to everyone without exception. He did not raise his voice. He did not sound proud or rude. He sounded like someone reading a fact that could not be altered. A slight tension entered the air. The son glanced at the gates, then back at the guard. He had never been stopped like this before. His name had always been enough. His background had always opened doors. He took a step forward, lowering his voice. He suggested that someone higher up be contacted. Surely this could be cleared up quickly. The guard shook his head gently. The order, he explained, was already approved at the highest level. There was no need for calls. There was no appeal process. Now the confusion turned into discomfort. The son felt the attention around him. Guards remained still. Staff avoided eye contact. No one moved to help him. The familiar feeling of control began to slip away, replaced by uncertainty. He tried to keep his composure, but inside, frustration started to grow. He asked the guard directly if he understood who he was speaking to. The guard met his eyes. There was no challenge in his gaze, only resolve. He said yes, he understood perfectly. And because he understood, he could not break the order. That response landed harder than anger ever could. For the first time, the son realized this was not personal. This was not about him. This was about something larger, rules, boundaries, and authority that did not bend to names or connections. He stepped back slightly, taking a breath. His mind raced through possibilities. Had something happened inside? Was there a situation he had not been informed about? Why had no one warned him? The guard remained where he was, his posture unchanged. He felt the pressure too. He knew this moment might be discussed later. He knew his actions could be questioned. But the instruction in his pocket burned like a reminder. His duty was clear. Minutes passed, though it felt longer. The son tried one last time, not with demands but with reason. He spoke about how unusual this was, how unnecessary it seemed. He suggested that refusing him could cause embarrassment, misunderstanding, even tension within the household. The guard listened again. When the son finished, the guard replied softly but firmly. Orders were not about comfort or convenience. They existed for a reason, and sometimes that reason could not be shared. That was when the full reality settled in. The son looked around once more. The gates were still closed. The guards were still. The morning sun climbed higher, shining on a moment that felt strangely exposed. He felt something unfamiliar being on the outside. Slowly, he nodded. Not in agreement, but in acceptance of the situation as it stood. He turned back toward his vehicle, his steps heavier than when he arrived. As he left, whispers began among the staff, quiet and cautious. No one spoke loudly. Everyone understood they had witnessed something unusual, something that would not be forgotten quickly. The guard watched the vehicle disappear down the drive. Only then did he allow himself a silent breath. He had done his job, but he also knew this was only the beginning. Orders like that were never isolated events. They were signs of deeper decisions, hidden tensions, and changes unfolding behind closed doors. As the gates remained shut and the day continued, a question lingered in the air. If even familiar faces could be turned away, what else was about to change? And behind those gates, something important was clearly happening. The vehicle had barely disappeared from view when the feeling at the gate changed. What had just happened stayed in the air, heavy and unsettled. The guards returned to their positions, but their thoughts were no longer calm. Everyone knew this was not a normal refusal. It was a moment that quietly crossed a line no one often saw crossed. Inside the estate, news traveled without words. Staff sensed it through looks, pauses, and careful silence. Something had shifted. Something important was being protected. Camilla's son did not drive far before asking the driver to slow down. His mind was busy, replaying every second of the encounter. He was not angry yet. He was confused, and confusion can feel worse than anger. He had followed protocol. He had been calm. He had spoken with respect. Still, he had been stopped. That had never happened before. He leaned back, staring out of the window, watching the familiar surroundings pass by. These roads had always felt welcoming. Today they felt distant. He wondered if this had been planned or sudden. No message had reached him. No warning. No explanation. His phone buzzed. A message from someone inside the household asked if everything was all right. He paused before replying. He did not know how to explain what had happened without sounding dramatic or weak. Finally, he sent a short response saying there had been a delay and he would return later. He knew that was not true. Back at the gate, the senior guard remained alert. He did not relax, even after the situation had passed. Orders like the one he carried did not allow for comfort. They demanded focus. He replayed the exchange in his head, not out of doubt, but out of awareness. Every word mattered. Every tone mattered. He knew how easily such moments could be misunderstood. Another guard quietly approached him and asked if everything was fine. The senior guard nodded. He did not explain. He did not need to. The fewer words used, the better. Time passed slowly. The sun climbed higher. Visitors came and went, all checked carefully, all following the new limits without knowing why. Some noticed the change. Others did not. Meanwhile, Camilla's son decided to return, not to the gate, but to a nearby private area where he could think clearly. He sat alone, replaying the guard's voice in his mind. Calm, respectful, firm. That firmness stayed with him. He began to realize something important. This was not about personal conflict. It was about authority that no longer flowed the way he expected. For the first time, he felt what it was like to be subject to a rule rather than connected to it. That realization did not sit well. He called someone he trusted, someone familiar with the structure and routines of the estate. The conversation was cautious. He asked general questions, trying not to sound demanding. The answers he received were vague, too vague. That made his unease stronger. He ended the call feeling more uncertain than before. At the estate, the senior guard received quiet confirmation that the order remained active. No changes, no updates. He stood straighter when he heard that. It meant the earlier encounter was not the last challenge he would face that day. He understood the nature of such orders. They were designed not just to restrict movement but to send a message that rules were in place for reasons not everyone could see. As the afternoon approached, Camilla's son decided to try again. Not by force, not by argument, but by presence. He returned to the gate on foot, hoping the change in approach might open a conversation. The guards noticed him immediately. The senior guard stepped forward once more. This time, the son spoke first. His voice was steady, but the confidence behind it was thinner. He said he wanted to understand, not to argue, just to understand. The guard listened carefully. He respected the request, but he also knew his answer would disappoint. He explained again that the order did not include explanations. It was clear, direct, and temporary. That was all he could say. The son frowned slightly. He asked if the order applied to everyone. The guard answered yes. No names were listed, no exceptions written. That answer struck something deep. For years, names had mattered, titles had mattered. Family connections had mattered. Now, suddenly, none of that seemed to apply. The son felt a mix of frustration and something else he did not like to admit, vulnerability. Standing there, outside a gate he had always passed through, he felt smaller than he ever had in that place. He looked at the guard closely. He saw no enjoyment in the refusal, no pride, only discipline. That made it harder to react. He considered raising his voice. He considered demanding action, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the stillness of the guards. Perhaps it was the realization that this moment was being watched quietly by more people than he could see. He took a breath and stepped back. Inside, the guard felt the tension too. Turning someone away was never easy, especially someone so well known. But he also felt something else: clarity. The clarity of knowing he was doing exactly what was required of him, nothing more, nothing less. As the son turned away again, the guard understood that this moment would linger, not because of drama, but because of what it represented. A reminder that systems exist beyond individuals. Walking away for the second time felt heavier than the first. The son no longer felt confused. He felt challenged. His sense of place had been shaken. Questions filled his mind, not about the guard, but about his own role. Who decided these boundaries? Why now? And what did it mean for him going forward? As the gates closed behind him once more, the answer remained hidden. But one thing was clear: the rules had changed, and this time, even familiarity offered no protection. And deep inside the estate, whatever had caused this shift was still unfolding, unseen, untouched, and firmly guarded. The third time did not begin with movement, but with silence. The silence that comes when people realize a situation has grown larger than expected. Camilla's son spent the evening thinking, replaying the day again and again. Sleep did not come easily. Questions pressed on his mind, heavy and unanswered. By morning, confusion had hardened into determination. He decided that this time he would not approach the gate as a visitor. He would approach it as someone who deserved clarity. When he arrived again, the atmosphere felt different. The guards were the same, the gates unchanged, but something beneath the surface had shifted. The senior guard noticed it immediately. He had learned to read people, not just movements. He could see it in the way the man walked, slower but more deliberate. Camilla's son stopped a few steps away from the gate. He did not smile this time. He did not explain who he was. He simply asked one question, quietly but firmly. He asked who had the authority to issue such an order. The guard paused before answering, not because he did not know, but because he knew how powerful the answer would be. He chose his words carefully. He explained that the order came from the highest level of command, approved through official channels and locked into protocol. The son listened closely. His jaw tightened slightly. He asked if there was anyone at all, who could override it. The guard looked at him directly. His voice did not change when he spoke the words that would stay with everyone who heard them. Not even Charles could override this order. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The guards nearby froze, their posture unchanged but their awareness sharpened. Staff standing at a distance felt the weight of the sentence without fully understanding why. The air felt heavier, as if the gates themselves had absorbed the meaning. Camilla's son stared at the guard, not in disbelief, but in shock. That single sentence shattered every remaining assumption he had held onto. It was not just a refusal. It was a clear boundary, drawn with absolute certainty. He took a step back without realizing it. In his entire life, there had always been a higher door to knock on, a higher voice to appeal to. That door had just been closed in front of him, calmly and without apology. He searched the guard's face for doubt. He found none. The guard was not challenging power. He was standing inside it. The son felt something unfamiliar rise inside him, not anger, not fear, but exposure. He suddenly understood how thin the line was between influence and limitation, how easily status could fade when structure took control. He tried to speak, but his words felt smaller now. He asked why such a strong order was needed. The guard shook his head gently. He explained that some decisions were made to protect stability, not individuals, and stability required silence as much as action. That explanation offered no comfort. Memories surfaced in the son's mind, moments when access had been automatic, when doors opened without thought, when his presence had never been questioned. Those memories now felt distant, almost unreal. Around them, no one moved. No one interrupted. Everyone understood this was not a conversation meant for interruption. The son finally nodded slowly. He did not agree, but he accepted the truth of what he had heard. He realized pushing further would change nothing. It would only expose him more. He turned away from the gate, but this time he did not leave immediately. He stood still, staring at the closed entrance as if seeing it for the first time. Inside the guard, emotion stirred quietly. He was aware of the weight of what he had said. He knew repeating that line would echo far beyond this moment, but he also knew it was necessary. Orders like this were designed to be absolute, not flexible. He did not feel powerful. He felt responsible. Camilla's son finally walked back to his vehicle. His steps were steady, but his thoughts were not. The sentence repeated in his mind again and again. Not even Charles. Those words reshaped his understanding of authority. As he drove away, he noticed how ordinary everything outside the estate looked. Cars passed. People walked. Life continued. The world had not changed, but his place within it had shifted. Back at the gate, the guards returned to their routine, but none of them forgot what had just happened. Moments like this became part of unspoken memory, shared through looks rather than words. Inside the estate, deeper discussions were unfolding. Decisions had been made quietly, carefully, and with long-term consequences in mind. The order was not about one person. It was about control, timing, and protection. Camilla's son spent the rest of the day alone. Calls came in, but he ignored most of them. He needed time to process what had happened. For the first time, he felt removed from the center of things, pushed to the edge by forces he could not influence. He began to understand that real authority did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it stood quietly behind a gate, enforced by someone with no title, no fame, only duty. As evening fell, the estate remained calm. The gate stayed closed. The guard stayed at his post. And somewhere beyond those walls, a man learned that power, once assumed permanent, could be paused with a single order. The lesson was simple but painful. Some lines are not meant to be crossed, and some decisions exist beyond family, beyond names, and beyond reach. And that realization would follow him long after the gates finally opened again. The night after the third encounter was quiet, but it was not peaceful. For the senior guard, silence did not mean rest. It meant reflection. He stood at his post as he always did, watching the lights inside the estate glow softly against the dark. From the outside, everything looked calm. From the inside, he knew it was not. He had delivered many difficult messages in his career, but this one stayed with him. Not because of who it involved, but because of what it represented. The words he had spoken were still clear in his mind. They had been necessary, but necessity did not remove their weight. He adjusted his stance, feeling the familiar pressure of responsibility settle on his shoulders. People often believed guards were just there to open and close gates, to stand still and follow instructions. Few understood the quiet burden that came with the uniform. Every decision, every word could echo far beyond the moment it was spoken. He thought about the man he had turned away. He had seen the change in his eyes, the moment confidence gave way to understanding. That look stayed with him. It reminded the guard that duty often placed him in the path of other people's disappointment. The guard had not chosen this order. He had not written it. But once it was placed in his hands, it became his responsibility to carry it without bending. That was the unspoken rule of service. You did not shape the order. You became its voice. Earlier that day, a younger guard had quietly asked him how he managed to stay so calm. The senior guard had not answered right away. Calm was not something he felt naturally in moments like these. Calm was something he practiced, built through years of standing firm while emotions moved around him like waves. He remembered his early days in service, when he believed strength meant authority alone. Over time, he learned that real strength was restraint. It was knowing when not to explain, when not to argue, when to stand still and let the rule speak for itself. Inside the estate, discussions continued behind closed doors. The guard was not part of them, and he did not need to be. His role was not to understand every reason, but to protect the space that allowed decisions to be carried out safely. That understanding brought him a strange sense of peace, even when situations became tense. As the night deepened, he noticed how quiet the grounds felt. Even the usual movements were slower, more careful. Staff members walked with purpose but avoided unnecessary interaction. Everyone seemed aware that the estate was in a sensitive moment, even if they did not know the details. The guard remained alert. Orders like this required more than physical presence. They required awareness. One mistake, one moment of sympathy overriding judgment could undo everything. He thought about his own life beyond the gate. A simple home, a routine built on early mornings and late nights. Few people knew where he worked or what he protected. He preferred it that way. His identity was not tied to recognition. It was tied to reliability. That night, he did not sleep much, not because of fear, but because of thought. He wondered how often people mistook access for belonging, how often they assumed closeness meant control. The day's events had shown him how fragile those assumptions could be. By morning, he was back at his post, unchanged in appearance but carrying the quiet understanding of what the previous day had meant. The air felt different, sharper somehow. The estate was still, but it felt watchful. A few staff members greeted him with respectful nods. There was a subtle shift in how they looked at him, Not admiration, not curiosity, but recognition. They had seen him stand firm. They understood that his loyalty was not personal. It was professional. Later in the day, a brief message came through confirming that the order was still active. No further instructions, no timeline, just confirmation. The guard acknowledged it with a short reply and returned his focus to the gate. He noticed that no further attempts were made to enter from familiar faces. Word had spread quietly. Boundaries had been understood. That alone told him how powerful the moment had been. Still, he felt the emotional cost of it. Turning people away was never easy, especially when they expected welcome. He reminded himself that fairness did not mean comfort. Sometimes, fairness meant consistency. As hours passed, he observed the world outside the gate moving as usual. Visitors came for permitted reasons. Vehicles passed. Life continued. The contrast between the calm outside and the tension inside the estate was striking. He realized something then. His role was not just about protection. It was about balance, holding the line so others could work through change without chaos. Toward evening, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought about how authority was often misunderstood. People assumed it lived at the top, invisible figures and loud decisions. But authority also lived in quiet places, in written orders, in individuals trusted to enforce them without question. He was one of those individuals. That realization did not fill him with pride. It filled him with humility. Being trusted with such responsibility meant he had to be careful, measured, and fair at all times. As the sun lowered and shadows stretched across the grounds, the guard stood exactly where he had stood the day before. The gate remained closed. The rules remained unchanged. He knew this situation would eventually pass. Orders were rarely permanent, but the lesson would remain for him and for others. Names could open doors, but only when rules allowed them to. That night, as he handed over to the next shift and prepared to leave, he took one last look at the gate. It stood silent, strong, and unmoved. He walked away knowing he had done his duty, not for recognition, not for approval, but because responsibility, once given, must be carried fully. And somewhere beyond the walls, the effects of that duty continued to unfold, quietly reshaping how power, access, and authority were understood by those who had always assumed they were untouchable. The guard went home, rested briefly, and prepared to return the next day, because duty did not end when the gate closed. It lived on, steady and unseen, in the choices made by those trusted to stand firm when it mattered most. The days that followed were quieter, but the quiet felt different from before. It was not empty. It was thoughtful. The kind of quiet that comes after something important has happened, and everyone is still trying to understand what it means. Inside the estate, routines slowly returned to normal, but not completely. People moved carefully, spoke softly, and paid closer attention to rules that had always existed but were rarely tested. The closed gate had reminded everyone that boundaries were real, even in places where familiarity often blurred them. Camilla's son stayed away. He did not return to the gate, and no messages were sent asking for special access. Instead, he kept his distance, choosing time and space over confrontation. What he had learned could not be undone with another attempt. At home, he reflected more than he spoke. Friends noticed the change in him. He listened more. He paused before responding. The confidence that once flowed easily was still there, but it had matured into something quieter. He thought often about the guard, not with anger, not with blame, but with curiosity. That man had stood firm without raising his voice, without showing fear or pride. For the first time, the son truly understood that authority did not always look impressive. Sometimes it looked ordinary, calm, and unmovable. He began to see his life differently. Doors had opened for him for so long that he had never considered what it felt like when one stayed shut. That experience had humbled him in ways no lecture ever could. Meanwhile, the senior guard continued his work as he always had. There were no ceremonies, no praise, no acknowledgement beyond quiet respect, and that was enough. He noticed subtle changes around him. Guards followed procedure more closely. Staff members checked details twice. The system had been reminded of its strength, and everyone adjusted accordingly. One afternoon, as the guard stood at his post, a younger colleague asked him if the situation had been difficult. The guard thought for a moment before answering. He said difficulty was not the problem. Responsibility was. Doing the right thing was often uncomfortable, but discomfort passed. Integrity stayed. Those words stayed with the younger guard long after the shift ended. Over time, the order was eventually lifted. Not announced loudly, not explained publicly. Just quietly removed, as such decisions often were. The gates returned to their usual rhythm. Familiar faces came and went again, but something had changed. Even when access returned, the understanding remained. Rules were not suggestions, they were foundations. And foundations did not move for convenience. Camilla's son eventually returned to the estate, but not with the same expectations. He arrived with awareness instead of assumption. The interaction at the gate was polite, brief, and respectful. No tension, no history discussed. The guard recognized him. The son recognized the guard. They exchanged a simple nod. Nothing more was needed. In that small gesture, there was mutual understanding. The son walked through the gate this time, but the experience stayed with him. He carried it into meetings, conversations, and decisions. He learned to respect limits, not as punishment, but as structure. The guard watched him pass, feeling no victory, no loss, only closure. Life continued for both men, each changed in quiet ways. One learned that privilege had boundaries. The other was reminded that duty mattered most when it was hardest to uphold. Among the staff, the story of the closed gate was rarely spoken about openly. It did not need to be. It lived in memory, in behavior, in the way people respected the system just a little more than before. The estate remained what it had always been, secure, controlled, and carefully managed. But beneath the surface, there was a deeper awareness. A reminder that stability depended on rules being honored, not bypassed. In the end, there were no winners and no losers. Only lessons. Power was not removed. It was defined. Authority was not challenged. It was clarified, and respect was no longer assumed. It was earned through restraint, patience, and understanding. The guard continued to stand at the gate, day after day, unseen by most, remembered by some. He did not think of the moment often, but when he did, he felt certain of one thing. He had done what was right. And sometimes, that was the most important role anyone could play.